We're going to discuss the one idea today, which I sometimes also call the bridge concept. The one idea is the point at which you bridge from your story to your message, whether that's a content message, whether that's a sales pitch. It's where the rubber hits the road in terms of business storytelling and connecting to the message that you're trying to lead people towards. So I first covered this about 5 years ago on the podcast, so let me play you that recording first, and then I'll be back at the end with a 5-year retrospective on the one idea. I want to take you back to March 2020, early March 2020. And my wife Lindsay was pregnant, 29 weeks pregnant to be exact. So for any men listening, babies are normally born at 40 weeks. And my wife Lindsay was under midwife observation because our first baby was born premature, and she had something called preeclampsia first time round. Preeclampsia can probably be best described as a collection of symptoms, but ultimately it means that the baby stops growing, and it can be dangerous both to the baby and to the mum. One of the things that they look for is signs of protein in the urine. So she was monitored for this quite regularly. So she went into hospital for a routine checkup. And they said, look, you've got, protein in your wee, so we're going to ask you to stay in overnight. We just knew that this was the beginning. She actually went into hospital with full overnight bag, like she was moving in. And the midwife on the desk actually said to her, well, you're prepared, aren't you? It's like, well, yeah. And what that meant was that I was suddenly thrown into being a single dad. So I had to stay at home with my son Hugo, who was 2. Which immediately, overnight, left very little time for work. The only time I had to work was between 5 and 6 in the morning and between 8 and 10 at night. So I'm there, I'm being a full-time dad for, the first time ever, realising how hard it is, realising what people go through. We're hanging around in parks for an hour a day, would go to the hospital, would see Lindsay. Would swap over for an hour or so. But by and large, I was a bystander. I was just at home, I was holding things together. There wasn't actually much that I could do. Lindsay stayed in hospital for, I'd say, the best part of 3 weeks. So when she was 32 weeks pregnant, the doctor said, look, we're going to deliver the baby tomorrow. And I remember being in theatre for the C-section. It was different second time round because they were practicing for the COVID precautions that they would be taking. So they were all in masks and visors and all of this kind of stuff. But I remember the theatre experience very, very clearly. I remember the sounds. I remember the shuffle of Crocs on the floor. I remember the rumble of a big, huge extractor fan above the surgery table. I remember the cheerfulness of the anaesthetist. I remember Rumour being born, in effect, and uttering a few tiny, tiny cries and being carried past on a small tray, completely blue, to the back of the room where the neonatal team were ready to give her oxygen. And I sat there as utterly a bystander, completely helpless. I don't know if you've ever felt helpless at all in the last year or so, but helpless was my one idea from that story, and the one idea is the thing that we're talking about today. The one idea is the point at which you leave your story and enter your content. So, as always on the podcast, we're going to approach this from 3 ideas. The first idea is bridging. The second idea is taking the opposite of the one idea. And the third idea is seeding. So let's have a look at the first idea. The concept of bridging is not new in the art of storytelling. And the one idea could very much be thought of as a bridge concept between your story and your content. So in my training courses, I teach this as being like a sandwich. So if you think about a sandwich, either an open sandwich or a closed sandwich, the filling in the sandwich is the story. So in the story that I just told you, we're using what I call the open sandwich format because we're going straight into the story. And at some point you stop telling the story and you start talking about your content. So your content is your message, potentially your sales pitch if you're including a sales pitch. It's your call to action. So my one idea in the story that I've just told you was that I was helpless. And then I've bridged that into the content by asking you, have you ever felt helpless in the last 12 months? The bridge is very obvious when you point it out. It's like when I point back at the story and say, this is what I did, this is the bridge concept, these are the words that I used. It's very obvious. But there's something about the hypnotic power of a story that means that even when you make the one idea or the bridge concept, even when you make the one idea quite obvious, the people reading the story or the people listening to the story, because they're kind of in this trance-like state almost of listening to the story, they normally won't notice the one idea. So actually what you're doing is you're guiding their attention to the thing that you want them to think that the story is about. And this is very powerful because you can actually end the story on different ideas and the story becomes about different things. There are other one ideas that I could have ended my story on. I could have said, I was utterly a bystander, but I was there to support my wife and to support my newborn baby. So then support would have been the one idea. And then I could have started the content by talking about, have you had to support an elderly relative over the last 12 months? That's how support connects the story and the content and makes one flow relatively seamlessly from one to the next. And actually the person reading the story or listening to the story shouldn't really notice that you've stopped telling the story. It should just be a continual flow. Another one idea that I could have used would have been commitment. I could have ended the story by saying I was in theatre, I was utterly a bystander, but I was there, I was an absolute commitment. So then commitment becomes the one idea. And then you start off your content by asking, if you were to convert that into a sales pitch, it's like, well, do your customers have to commit to your products and services? So commitment becomes the connection between the story and the content. The one idea is quite powerful because it means that the story doesn't actually have to exactly match the content. You don't have to find the perfect story to talk about the thing that you're trying to illustrate. And this is critically important because it takes a lot of the pressure off story selection. It means that you can basically tell stories about the things that you are most interested in. I will talk about story selection more in another episode, but the thing that's universal about the story that I selected was that it's about birth. And birth is one of those powerful stories that we always resonate, even if you've never given birth or even if, you haven't got any kids. It's a universal human thing. We see our friends going through this. We see our families going through this. So it's something that automatically resonates. But actually the usage of the story is quite flexible by adjusting the ending. If I want to match the story to a different piece of content, I don't have to re-engineer the whole story. I just have to re-engineer the ending of the story. So that's the concept of bridging. The second idea I want to talk to you about is taking the opposite of the one idea. And actually this opens up the possibilities of the one idea even further. All of the one ideas that I've just suggested, so helpless, support, and commitment, they are all quite focused on how I felt at the time. They are my kind of summary of my main emotions from that story. You could also make the one idea the opposite of those emotions. You could turn the one idea on its head. So for instance, I could have ended the story by saying, I was utterly a bystander. No degree of planning would have prepared me for this. So then planning becomes the one idea. And we're using the story to illustrate the concept of planning by showing how utterly out of control I was. So it's almost like a negative one idea. So you're still connecting to the thing that you want people to take away from the story, but you're using the opposite one idea. I want to give you another example of this to try and illustrate the concept. So I go running quite a lot, and I go barefoot running in my local park. So just on the grass, there's a grassy slope, and I will run barefoot up and down, up and down. Normally when it's warm enough, I don't do it in the middle of winter. But one of the main things I get from that is a real connection to the floor. It feels like a very natural thing to do. It feels like an inherited memory that once you start barefoot running, that you've always been running your entire life this way. It's just that you've forgotten how. And it's the connection to the floor, for me, that evokes that. So the one idea of that little anecdote is connection. So what would the opposite of that be? I think it's worth thinking about that the opposite isn't just going to be disconnection. That's basically the same one idea. If you're just converting connection to disconnection, then you're not really opening up any additional possibilities. The opposite to me would be something like endurance, because that's what most runners do when they're out pounding the pavements. It's the opposite of an endurance run. So I could use endurance as the one idea. So it's not necessarily the direct opposite of the original one idea that you had. It's the opposite in a more extrapolated way. Quite difficult to explain that, but I hope you can sort of see that there's more possibilities open to you by taking the opposite concept of your original one idea. The third idea I want to talk about on today's podcast is seeding. So seeding is where you plant the one idea in the story before you actually get to the one idea. So in this story that I told you about birthing my daughter and my wife having preeclampsia, I'd started to seed the idea of me being helpless earlier in the story, when suddenly I was thrown into being a single dad, suddenly I was at home with my 2-year-old son, suddenly I had very little time for work. I'm alluding at a growing sense of helplessness, so that when I end the story on the concept of being helpless, it's not a surprise to you. It's not like I've just pulled it out of the blue, because it fits in with little things I've said and I've seeded throughout the story. This is actually easier to do when you're writing than when you're talking. When you're talking, it's often easier just to rattle off the story, whereas when you're writing a story, you can pay attention to these small things. So again, seeding isn't necessary for a successful one idea, for a successful bridge between story and content, but it's something that can help. It's something that can lay the foundations, lay the groundwork for one idea that's coming at the end of the story. So it's an advanced technique, I guess, but it's something that will make your stories flow a little more seamlessly from the end of the story to the message that you want to communicate. So that was the one idea. Quite a simple concept in theory, but what I found with my students is it's a harder thing to put into practice. It's quite easy to understand the concept of ending the story on one idea, starting on the same idea into your content. That's not a very complicated idea, but actually putting it into practice, there's often more nuance than it maybe seems. Often one of the challenges is coming up with all of the different one ideas that you might want to use in a story, so that you can view the story as usable in more circumstances. So put it into practice. The next time you're writing an email for your business, put it into practice. Try telling a story. Try ending the story on a particular single idea, and then try starting your message or your call to action on the same idea, and just see how it goes. Let's do a bit of a summary of today's episode. So, as always, we've covered 3 ideas. The first idea was the concept of bridging, the idea that the one idea bridges the story to the content, so that when the reader is reading the story, they shouldn't actually notice that you've stopped telling a story and you've started telling your content. It should just flow seamlessly from one to the next. The second idea is that you can expand the number of one ideas that you could potentially use with a story by taking the opposite one idea. This isn't normally the direct opposite of the one idea, but normally it's an alternative concept that can also then be used to illustrate your points. The third idea we talked about was seeding, was the idea of planting the one idea, planting hints of the one idea earlier in the story, so that when you actually get to the one idea, it doesn't stand out like a sore thumb. Okay, we're back in 2026 now. Let me just give you a bit of a 5-year reflection on the one idea. I think that was pretty good, you know. There's not much I would change about what I said 5 years ago and the one idea. Just a note on the terminology. I think I was clearly hedging my bets at the time of, do I call it the one idea? Do I call it the bridge concept? I'm still not clear on that, to be honest, which is why I call it both things. Some people find it helpful to have the bridge analogy in their head, whereas other people find it helpful to have the one idea as a thing, because the one idea as a concept forces you to pick one thing. You're picking one exit point from the story and one entry point into your content. So it kind of works both ways. So
I'm still calling it both things. I'm still calling it the one idea and the bridge concept because it is both things. So ask me again in another 5 years, and we'll see if I've chosen my preferred terminology on that. Ignoring terminology, I mentioned in the episode that I believed that selecting the opposite concept as your one idea was an advanced idea. I think something I want to say, listening back to that episode now, I don't think you want to be afraid of anything that I've said there in terms of picking out of one idea that's not the literal thing itself, but the opposite concept. So I talked about my barefoot running story and how the opposite of connection isn't necessarily disconnection. It could be endurance or powering through, running through walls. That could be the opposite, pounding the pavements. So I don't think we need to be afraid of stuff where I've kind of marked it as being an advanced topic. I don't know that it actually is an advanced topic. It's maybe just more of a nuance and something to get to grips with. And again, you get to grips with it through practice and through use. So don't be afraid of it. Just keep putting these principles into practice, and your skill will increase with time. I also mentioned seeding as an advanced idea. So seeding being where you start to mention the one idea earlier on in the story, or you allude to the one idea without naming it directly. And again, this is one of those things where I don't think we need to be scared of it. Just the other day, I was speaking to a client who was telling me a story, and in the telling, I didn't prompt him to do this, but he seeded the one idea earlier in the story. And what the seeding does is it creates this pattern repetition, so that when the one idea does show up, it's not out of the blue. It's a repeat of a pattern that you've seeded earlier on in the story. So you're creating this kind of pattern recognition, so that when the one idea shows up, it doesn't feel like it's been crowbarred in, and it helps to generate this seamless transition from story to content, where people don't even often realize that you've been telling a story and that you transition to your message. The consumer of your message doesn't distinguish between story and content in the same way as you and I do in the planning of your story. So something I've reflected on since is that I think seeding is actually quite important. So don't be afraid of it. I think it's something, again, to just be mindful of as you're telling your story. And this all comes back to the importance of the timeline. The one idea is the end point of your timeline. So the main thing in the telling of a story is to be clear at the outset, is to have done this planning first, to be clear on what your timeline looks like, what are the main beats of the story that you're going to tell, and what's the one idea that you're going to end on. You could really take the timeline episode last week and the one idea episode this week as being two sides of the same coin, and something that you can put into practice. Both of these episodes have been about how do you plan the story before you start telling the story. This is especially important since more of the stories that we're now telling, or I'm now telling, are verbal stories rather than written stories. It's very important to plan the story first so that you're clear, so that you don't mess it up, so that you don't drop the ball. So the timeline and the one idea are kind of part of that same planning process. I do believe that the importance of this plan, of having that plan, having the clarity on the story that you're trying to tell and the endpoint that you're trying to lead towards, I think the importance of having that plan in place has gone up in the last 5 years, if anything. And that's because we're telling more verbal stories. We're then getting the transcripts of those stories and converting the transcripts into written media. What else is going on in my world? I realised actually on last week's timeline episode that I forgot to do a what's going on in my world section at the end. When you stop recording and you go, something wasn't right about that recording. It's like, I haven't shared what I've been up to. How will the people live? What's been going on in my world? Well, last week I took Hugo. So Hugo is my 8-year-old son. We live in Sheffield in northern England. He's never been to London before. I've been meaning to take him to London for quite a long time. And he's been slamming me recently with facts about blue whales. I think they've been learning about blue whales at school. And he's been giving me all these facts about blue whales, about how big they are, how heavy they are. And then all of a sudden it popped into my head. It's like, I know where there's a blue whale. There's a skeleton of a blue whale hanging in the main entrance hall in the National History Museum in South Kensington in London. So all of a sudden, this idea of maybe I'll take Hugo to London one day became a plan, where we suddenly planned a lads trip. So we did an overnight trip to London. We got up very early on the Thursday, got a very early train down. So there's a separate story about that. And in fact, I might save this story until next week and tell you the full story of taking Hugo to London. But that's what we've been up to. So I'm gonna tell the type of story that I hate here, where I tell you I begin telling you a story and then I cut it off and say, tune in next time to see how this one plays out. But that's what's been going on in my world. As always with all of your stories, you want to be keeping an eye out for stories that are up to date, that are fresh out of the pan, that are going to be usable in your marketing, so that you can just tell people what you've been up to, because how you do one thing is how you do everything. So if you're telling stories about the things that you've been up to on a weekly basis, monthly basis, they're going to get a feel for who you are, the decisions that you make, the values that you live by. It just communicates that. It shows your values rather than telling your values. That's why it's good to carry on to have this section at the end of your podcasts, at the end of your blog posts, at the end of your webinars, whatever it is, where you just say what's going on in your world and just share a little bit about what's going on for you. On the next episode of Story Systems, it's going to be a new episode. So a change in the last 5 years, as I mentioned, is that we've shifted from verbalizing stories first rather than writing stories. So I'm going to be talking about it next time. So the process being, you've got your story, you've got your timeline, you've got your one idea. Previously, I'd have then suggested going off and writing a first draft, but it might be now that you're better off just talking through the story. So we'll talk about that next time. If you found this episode of Story Systems helpful, you'll want to make sure you're on my email list. I'll send you a copy of my Lead Incubator System Blueprint and also my top 5 core story prompts for entrepreneurs. Head to storyrob.com/podcast. You can also find my book by searching on Amazon for Simple Story Selling. See you next time.